Genetic engineering and genetic manipulation is usually a really contentious issue. There's also pro and con arguments about genetic engineering. So we're going to look at some of those for CRISPR more specifically and some for genetic engineering in general. I'm going to highlight in green the pros and then I'll choose another color to highlight the cons or the negative arguments. So CRISPR time-wise is generally quite quick, quite cheap, and also quite flexible because we can make CRISPR and Cas9 proteins that be complementary to lots of different sequences. Also, CRISPR is quite accurate, so it has quite high accuracy levels compared to some other methods. However, we do see issues with, we've got purple for the cons or limitations. We do see issues with mutations because if we've got mutations in sequences that we're looking for in CRISPR, they can throw it off and CRISPR will be unable to find a particular particular sequence that we want to make cuts at. So mutations will throw CRISPR off. And also the fact that CRISPR uses or bases its cuts on shorter sequences of DNA. So the nucleotide sequences are shorter. There's a risk that they can be repeat sequences, so appear elsewhere in a genome, and we'll see them, that sequence be found and cut in the wrong position. So looking at genetic engineering more broadly and some of the pros and cons involved, or some of the possible good applications and then some of the social issues around some of this. Genetic engineering can be helpful in crime scenes, so we can use DNA profiling and genetic manipulation to try and help catch criminals. We can also give more targeted health cures because of a genetic understanding. Genetic manipulation could possibly insert and remove genes, insert normal genes, we've got damaged genes, or find issues with genetic disease nice and early on in the piece. We've also got higher yields, so I'll go higher yields and resistant plants. So they're two possible applications for genetic manipulation in order to create plants that give us more of the product, the fruit or whatever that we're looking for, or also make them resistant to things like pests or things like frost, which can help poverty and allow plants to grow in harsher conditions in third world countries that they might not have usually, in order to give people access to more food than they otherwise would have. If we look though at some of the limitations here, there's a number that I want to talk about, or just question marks or queries, I guess, about genetic manipulation. Discrimination is one. If we have a greater understanding of the genetics behind different traits and attributes, some people might be employed or given access to sports training and things like that based upon their genetic makeup because they might be more suitable to particular occupations or sports. There's also the issue of access. If we have a really good understanding of people's genomes and their genetic makeup and that's information saved somewhere, well, who has access to that? What happens if it gets hacked? There's fears that if we make mistakes when we are genetically engineering organisms, that they could lead to tumor suppressing genes, proto-oncogenes and things like that being messed with and lead to cancer. And there's also the issue of animal ethics. So for example, Dolly the sheep was cloned a couple of decades ago. Is that an ethical thing to do? The sheep ended up dying quite young, so perhaps not. People worry about the fact that we might be playing God, so we might be meddling in stuff that we shouldn't be. And also, I guess, generally there's a number of unknown risks involved that we might not yet understand. There is potential for insurance refusal. So the worry is that if people have quite a high amount of known genetic diseases, then insurance companies won't allow them to purchase health insurance because they'll see them as a liability. And if there are particular companies that have the ability to monopolize, so have control over certain gene editing techniques, well, is that fair? And they might be able to jack prices up, make people pay a lot in order to have genetic diseases be observed and removed from their offspring and things like that. There's fears that as much as DNA profiling is really good for crime and being able to locate criminals, what if we get it wrong? We might incorrectly convict people because of mistakes with our DNA manipulation. Designer babies refers to the fact that technically if we can use CRISPR to remove genes and add them with others, they might lead to different phenotypes. So we technically could design a baby and at the zygote stage insert genes to give certain appearances or attributes they mightn't have had otherwise. A lot of people think, and I think rightly so, think that that's a really bad path to kind of be wandering down. And finally, because I did miss one positive application, finally, there's fears over lack of variation too. So if we create plants and manipulate organisms and things like that with all these desirable traits, we remove all the bad traits, they're going to be very, very similar. And that lack of variation could be worrying because we could see populations of different species wiped out because there's no variation, meaning that there's not going to be these slight differences making things more resistant to diseases or others. If everything's equally as resistant or non-resistant to a disease, one disease could wipe everything out. And just to go back to another positive application is in the fight against genetic disease. So if we have a really good understanding of the human genome and the ability to remove damaged or mutated genes that could have particular diseases linked to them, this could be seen as a positive and help people have a better quality of life and a greater chance of survival despite having a genetic disease. So there's some of the pros and cons to do with specifically CRISPR, and in general, some of the pros and cons, the social issues and arguments and applications around genetic engineering.